Teton Dam failed while it was still proving it could hold water. It was not old. It was not abandoned. It was not being tested after decades of neglect. The reservoir was rising for the first time. The concrete spillway was still dry. The embankment was new enough that the Bureau of Reclamation was still watching it fill. Then on the morning of June 5, 1976, muddy water appeared on the downstream face. Before noon, the dam would be an open failure. But the real failure had already happened earlier, in the belief that seeing danger was the same as being able to reduce it. That detail mattered more than the leak itself. Clear seepage can be monitored. Muddy seepage means the water is carrying soil with it. It means the dam is not just leaking, it is being taken apart from the inside. Operators tried to fight it with earth-moving equipment. Bulldozers moved toward the wet spots. Crews tried to push material into the seepage holes before the holes could grow. But by then, the defense of Teton Dam had become strangely small. A major federal project had been reduced to men and machines trying to plug a wound in an earth-fill wall. The question is not only why the dam failed, the question is why its first full reservoir became the first full test of a weakness that should have been treated as central from the beginning. This is not a story about a leak. It is a story about what happens when seepage becomes visible only after the reservoir has made a useful response impossible. The Teton River runs through eastern Idaho, below the Teton Range, across a landscape of farms, towns, canals, and floodplain roads. The dam was part of a Bureau of Reclamation project meant to store water for irrigation, flood control, power, and recreation. On paper, that made sense. The American West had been built around the idea that water could be captured, scheduled, and made useful. The Bureau had done that work for generations. It had also learned from hard experience that a dam is not a wall alone. A dam is a wall, a foundation, a spillway, an outlet system, a grout curtain, an inspection program, and a set of emergency assumptions that only matter when the wall begins to behave differently than expected. At Teton, the wall was a zoned earth-fill embankment. It stood in a canyon of volcanic rock. Its abutments and foundation contained fractures, joints, cavities, and open seams. Water did not need to invent a path through solid stone. The geology already offered paths. That does not automatically make a dam unsafe. Many dams are built on difficult foundations. The engineering question is whether the design treats the foundation as an enemy that must be restrained or as a problem that has already been solved. The official post-failure record is careful about the exact internal path of the water. It does not pretend that investigators could rewind the embankment grain by grain. But the central mechanism is clear enough. Seepage found a route through or near the right foundation in key trench area. It began removing material. That process is called piping. Once piping becomes strong enough, the dam starts making its own tunnel. That was the danger hiding behind the first muddy water. Downstream, the danger had human geography, not an abstract floodplain. Wilford, Sugar City, Rexburg, farms, roads, homes, and people whose safety depended on a federal structure upstream behaving as designed. The families in Sugar City and Rexburg had organized their lives around irrigated agriculture. They had built homes, planted fields, and raised children in a valley that a federal water project had made inhabitable. They were not people who had chosen a proximity to risk. They were people who had been placed in a flood corridor by the logic of water development and had no practical way to know how the canyon above them had been engineered. They were not the people who designed the dam. They were not the people who approved the foundation treatment, but they lived in the zone where the assumptions would be tested. The warning chain did not begin on June 5th. It began in the rock. During construction, crews and engineers encountered a foundation that needed treatment. Grouting was used to seal cracks and reduce seepage. A key trench was cut into the foundation to tie the embankment into the ground below. Those features were not decorative. They were the dam's defense against water finding a hidden route. The problem, as later reviewers described it, was not that no one knew the foundation mattered. The problem was that the design did not become conservative enough around what the foundation could do. I read the official review as a warning about confidence. The record does not say the Bureau lacked technical knowledge. It says the available knowledge was not translated into a dam with enough defensive margin. That is the first authorial claim of this episode. Teton Dam did not fail because water is mysterious. It failed because the project accepted a foundation risk that only looked controlled until the reservoir gave it pressure. The reservoir rose through the spring of 1976. Each day, more water pressed into the canyon. The higher the lake became, the more hydraulic force looked for a path. A first filling is not a ribbon cutting. It is a controlled confrontation between design and geology. Before that moment, calculations, borings, maps, inspections, and construction records can all suggest how the dam will behave. But the reservoir is the first instrument that tests the entire structure at once. It presses on the embankment. It presses into the abutments. It finds the smallest connected spaces in the foundation. It turns a paper assumption into a physical question. That is why first filling demands humility. The dam may be complete as a construction project. It is not yet proven as a water retaining system. There were seepage observations before the breach. The official history notes wet areas and flows. Some of them were treated as conditions to watch. That is normal on earth-filled dams. New embankments may show water. Instrumentation and inspection exist because the first filling is never a casual event. But there is a difference between watching a leak and having the capacity to remove the threat behind it. At Teton, the reservoir was high. The outlet works did not give operators a quick way to lower the lake enough to take pressure off the dam. The emergency spillway was not the tool that could save the embankment that morning. The project could see seepage. It could not quickly subtract the reservoir. That is a brutal engineering position. If seepage is clear, observation may be enough. If seepage becomes muddy, time begins to behave differently. Every minute is no longer just a minute on a clock. It is more water moving through the same route, more soil particles loosened, more room for the next flow, more evidence that the problem has left the surface and moved inside the dam. An emergency warning can move people. It can save lives, but it cannot turn a high reservoir into a low reservoir unless the dam was built with a way to do that fast enough. That missing ability is one of the quietest parts of the Teton story. It does not photograph as dramatically as a breach. It does not look as heroic as a bulldozer on the face of the dam, but it defines the emergency. The operators were not simply fighting a leak. They were fighting reservoir pressure with the reservoir still behind them. That is the second defense that was missing. Not only a stronger foundation treatment, not only a more conservative embankment design, but a way to make the reservoir stop pushing before the internal damage became self-feeding. At about 7:30 in the morning, workers saw muddy water issuing from the downstream face. The language matters. Muddy water. Not just wet ground, not just seepage, water that had picked up the dam. Soon the seepage area enlarged. Material slumped. The wet spots became holes. Crews moved earth-moving equipment toward the face of the dam. Bulldozer operators attempted to push material into the openings. It is one of the most haunting images in American dam history because it is both brave and absurd. Heavy machines crawling across a failing embankment, trying to solve with weight and speed what had become a hydraulic problem inside the structure. For a short time, the response still looked like action. That is what makes the footage and photographs so dangerous to read emotionally. Action can make a failing system look recoverable, but a piping failure is not simply a hole on the outside. The visible hole is an exit. The real damage is the route the water has already carved behind it. By mid-morning, the dam was no longer only leaking, it was eroding. The right side of the embankment began to cut back. Water moved faster. Soil disappeared faster. Each cubic foot of escaping water made the next cubic foot easier. This is the midpoint of the story. Not the collapse, the moment the emergency changed categories. Before that, the question was, can crews stop the seepage? After that, the question was, how much time does the valley have? The Bureau's public record puts the release at about 1 million cubic feet per second. An ASDSO warning and evacuation summary gives a higher peak dam failure outflow, more than 2 million cubic feet per second. The exact number depends on the estimate being used, but every version points to the same reality. Once the breach opened, the reservoir was leaving faster than the valley could absorb. That number is hard to picture. So picture the map instead. A reservoir held behind a new dam, a canyon below it, Then the river corridor widening into farms and towns. The flood did not spread evenly like ink. It followed gravity. It took the Teton River Valley first, then moved toward the Snake River Plain. Warnings went out. Officials, law enforcement, radio stations, and local networks tried to move people out of the flood path. Many residents escaped because the breach was visible before the full flood wave arrived downstream. That is why the death toll was not far higher. The Bureau of Reclamation's public record gives the fatality count as 11 people. Other accounts sometimes use higher figures, especially when indirect deaths are included. This script uses the Bureau's official count and treats broader numbers cautiously. 11 people died. Thousands were displaced. Homes, farms, bridges, roads, livestock, and irrigation works were damaged or destroyed. Those numbers are not the entire meaning of the event. They are the human cost of the gap between a technical assumption and a valley that had to live below it. The flood wave hit communities that had not chosen the risk. Sugar City and Rexburg became part of the national record because a federal dam upstream lost the ability to remain a dam. The water carried debris, buildings, vehicles, farm equipment, and sediment. But the most important thing it carried was proof. The failure proved that Teton Dam's safety case had depended on a chain of defenses that was thinner than it looked. The foundation treatment had to be enough. The grout curtain had to be enough. The key trench had to be enough. The monitoring had to catch trouble early enough. The outlet capacity had to be enough, or else the dam had to be sound enough not to need it. On June 5th, the chain was tested from the wrong end. Afterward, investigations did what investigations do. They gathered photographs. They studied the foundation. They examined design decisions. They looked at seepage, rock, grout, compaction, filters, and construction records. One independent panel concluded that the most probable physical failure involved internal erosion associated with the right abutment, the key trench, and foundation conditions. The later review group used stronger institutional language. It argued that the Bureau had information that should have led to a different level of defense. I am willing to argue the review group's harshest finding is not the physical cause. It is the implication that Teton was treated as an engineering problem after the agency already had enough evidence to treat it as an institutional warning. That distinction is important. Engineering problems involve uncertainty, field conditions, and judgment. An institutional warning is what happens when that uncertainty has become visible enough that the organization has to change the margin. That is where the Teton record becomes larger than one canyon in Idaho. A technical warning can be domesticated by procedure. It is not denied. It is processed into the project as one more thing the project believes it has handled. That is why a simple phrase like, "the dam failed," is too small. The embankment failed, yes. But before that, a definition of adequate defense failed. A dam can look massive and still depend on narrow assumptions. Teton was hundreds of feet high. It held a growing reservoir. From a distance, it looked like permanence made visible. But permanence in a dam is not visual. It is internal. It is whether water can be controlled where no camera can see it. It is whether small seepage has a filter zone that keeps soil from moving. It is whether fractured rock has been treated as a live threat. It is whether operators have a way to reduce pressure before a leak becomes a breach. The Teton disaster asks a colder question than whether someone saw water that morning. People saw water. They saw muddy water. They reacted. The harder question is why the only visible response left, at the decisive moment, was to drive bulldozers toward the face of a dam whose failure was already forming inside. That image should not be used as spectacle. It should be used as a diagram. The bulldozers were not the cause. They were the final scale indicator. When an earth-filled dam's last line of defense is a machine trying to push soil into a growing seepage hole, the failure has moved beyond the machine. In the official memory of American infrastructure, Teton became a case study. Dam safety programs changed. Review procedures changed. The failure became part of engineering education. A warning about first filling, foundation treatment, internal erosion, filters, and emergency planning. But the public memory is smaller than the engineering memory. Outside Idaho, many people know the footage better than the warning chain. They know the dramatic breach. They know the strange fact that a new dam failed the first time it filled. The deeper story is less viral and more useful. The warning categories existed: difficult foundation, seepage risk, first filling, limited drawdown capacity, downstream communities in the flood path. Each one could be managed as a separate concern. Together, they made the morning of June 5th almost impossible to rescue once muddy water appeared. There is still uncertainty in the exact internal route the water took. No report can crawl back through an embankment after a breach has emptied a reservoir through it. But uncertainty about the precise path is not uncertainty about the lesson. The dam did not need a single dramatic trigger. It needed pressure, a vulnerable route, erodible material, and insufficient defense against internal erosion. That is the discipline the record demands. Do not pretend to know more than the investigation could prove, but do not use uncertainty to soften what it did prove. The disaster did not begin when muddy water tore through the downstream face. It began when defense was reduced to a grout curtain, a key trench, and confidence that seepage would stay small. What failed in Idaho was not only an embankment. It was the idea that a difficult foundation could be made safe without giving the valley enough margin if that confidence was wrong. The flood lasted hours. The reconstruction has lasted decades. And the most important image is not the final breach. It is the moment before it, when a brand new federal dam was still standing, and the only remaining question was whether anyone had left it a second line of defense.